What was the Enlightenment? Why were its ideas revolutionary? And how does the Enlightenment still impact us today? A lot of you did a good job sort of tying the beginnings of the Enlightenment back to the idea of sort of the development of the new science, right? How scientists like Galileo and Copernicus were using observation combined with sort of reason and mathematics to try to sort of identify the natural laws of the world. That was, of course, picked up by future scientists like Francis Bacon and, of course, Isaac Newton. And really sort of that attempt to try to use those methods to understand our natural surroundings was a hugely sort of popular theme across Europe at this point in time. But certainly your explanation of the Enlightenment had to go farther than that. It wasn't just revolved around the science, and really sort of that early aspect of new science, while it helped lead to the Enlightenment, it wasn't the Enlightenment itself. Really, the Enlightenment focuses on the time period, which is a little bit later, when people started then sort of taking that idea of finding and discovering the natural laws of science and instead decided we can take those same ideas and try to find those natural laws, but we're going to do it by looking at humans and humanity and how people interact. So trying to look at sort of the human condition and find the natural laws that should govern humanity. You can really sort of think of this as the beginning of kind of the social sciences in its very earliest forms of just trying to take a look at how do humans organize themselves? How do they behave? Why do they behave in this way? So trying to sort of find those natural laws that either do or should govern humanity becomes a huge part of the Enlightenment. And what this ultimately ends up leading to is a huge sort of questioning of tradition within Europe, particularly looking at the traditional role of government, which had, of course, primarily been based around strong monarchies, as well as a critique of religion, which of course had, first of all, sort of been dominated very much by the Catholic faith, but since that time period had really devolved into a lot of conflict between Protestants and Catholics, and in a lot of these countries there had been war and bloodshed, and really a lot of negative consequences, persecutions, and so forth, based around people's religion. So really sort of questioning how legitimate religion really was, how legitimate these governing systems, these monarchies actually were, and trying to say maybe that there are laws that exist that make these other more sort of traditional interpretations of sort of the power structures in Europe either irrelevant or incorrect. Maybe there's a different way to go about doing things. So, for example, one of the big elements that comes around in the Enlightenment, one of its main aspects, is the idea of sort of individual rights, that people have sort of individual rights that should be observed, that should not be violated, that everyone should have sort of these things that they can always rely on or count on in how they're going to be treated by other individuals and societies. Now, certainly it was not holistic and was not being applied to everyone, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in the future. But if you talk about someone like John Locke and coming up with his ideas that everyone has the right to life, liberty, to owning and having property, that those were the sort of basic ideas of what he found as those natural rights. This is natural law that says all humans have a certain amount of rights. That very much dovetailed into sort of political rights, that the government sort of had its role, but the government should be working essentially for the people, not the people working for the government. Is kind of where the ideas of John Locke very much started to come in. And so the idea of representation becomes very, very important, right? That a government shouldn't just be composed of a king telling everyone what to do. It should be essentially built up by the consensus of the people that it is governing. Also, religious tolerance is another key hallmark of the Enlightenment. The fact that there was so much tension between religion, between the various religions, both Protestants and Catholics, but also between Christians and Jewish populations within Europe, Christians and the Islamic empires. This was, of course, after the wars we talked about last time with the Ottoman Empire. Um, so really looking at a much more sort of serious critique of religion and how it functions as part of the Enlightenment as well. And sort of the various Enlightenment thinkers come down on various sides of this. Some people still think that religion is still very sort of real, and even though some people might not be behaving themselves in the best way, that it's still something that should be used for sort of the foundation and basis of knowledge, whereas other people were completely willing to throw it out, saying, no, religions are just made up by people and human beings. They're just tools for people to use to get what they want. And really, this is the first time in Europe that you start seeing that sort of harsh of a critique of religion in general, and very much was influential from this time period moving forward as more and more people start sort of questioning the legitimacy of sort of religions in general. Just the idea of sort of the accumulation of knowledge is also very important. Remember Diderot and the creation of this encyclopedias, trying to sort of collect all of human knowledge and putting one source. Diderot had been a big fan of Wikipedia. I think that's sort of what he sort of had in mind. Maybe not entirely, maybe more a little more peer reviewed, but certainly you would have think that these early Enlightenment figures would have loved the access to knowledge that's available in our modern day time and age here, and just that idea of that knowledge is something that should be sought after and accumulated and preserved, was maybe not 100% new, but very much heightened during this time period. Also, the basic sort of idea that using reason and critical thinking was very, very important, and that sort of everyone should be doing that, and that is how you should sort of be making the choices in your decisions in life, not just doing what the government says, not just doing what the religion says, not just doing what anyone says, but sort of making your own thoughts or having your own ideas on matters, using your own critical thinking to say, what is it that I want to be doing, what is it that I should be doing. Some of you also brought up the idea of deism, and that definitely shows the shift in religion during the time of the Enlightenment. How a lot of Enlightenment thinkers still tried to sort of combine ideas of some sort of religion, because they didn't. It seemed like a lot of them weren't quite willing to completely abandon the idea of there being a God or a creator, but they took it in a very sort of abject sense. Just basic tenets of deism was that sort of God had created the universe, and then he stepped back and was not really getting involved. He wasn't super close, didn't really care what human beings were doing, but he did develop these sort of natural laws which governed the universe, and that's what the deists thought that they were trying to discover. They sort of were getting access to God by discovering these sort of natural laws. So the idea of natural rights that they thought would have sort of come down through sort of a sort of divine way that people are getting these rights, but that it wasn't something that sort of a God was sitting right there looking at you, sort of determining, is this something you deserve or you don't. As I mentioned earlier, the Enlightenment, though, certainly had its limits. On the one hand, it certainly was the beginning of the way people were beginning to think about humans and how they should be treated and what roles that they should be playing and how societies are constructed. But at the same point in time, primarily, most of the Enlightenment thinkers, not all of them, but most of them, were white men, and a lot of times their main concern was their rights and their freedoms and their ability to engage in this process. And for most of them, it did not occur to them that these rights should also pertain to other individuals. So, for example, women, for a large part, were left out of the Enlightenment. Not totally, and certainly I would say, first real push towards women's rights occurs during the Enlightenment, and you're going to see evidence of that for example, in the French Revolution. But for the most part, it wasn't going to be the main priority of taking those people who were sort of not already on the top of the social hierarchy and trying to sort of rearrange society based on that. Racism and slavery are going to work the same way. There are plenty of people who ascribed to the ideas of the Enlightenment, but still thought that slavery was perfectly justifiable, and still would have fallen into ideas of which we would very much consider today to be sort of a racist ideology. But it's important to note that these were sort of the beginnings of these ideas, and just like you could sort of say Martin Luther opened Pandora's box when he sort of left religion, or brought sort of the Catholic religion open to interpretation, and that's why you had sort of all these splinterings into various Protestant religions. A very similar process here happens with the Enlightenment, because when certain people start sort of claiming these rights for themselves and start saying that these are natural rights that all men possess, it doesn't take long for those ideas to be picked up by other people. For women to start saying, well, what about all women? Why don't we say these are rights that all people possess? It starts, people from all races, all religions, all ethnicities, eventually as time goes on, are going to be picking up on these ideas and broadening them to a level much farther than the sort of original interpreters of these ideas would have thought of them or perceived them. So why are these such a big idea? Why are they so revolutionary? Well, first of all, it was a real challenge to traditional European power structures. Most of the political power and authority in Europe was coming through two channels, primarily up until this point in time. It was the monarchies and it was the church or religion. And the Enlightenment is going to be criticizing and sort of poking holes and questioning both of those to a large degree. We'll be talking about a little bit more about sort of how these more conservative elements of European culture react a little bit later here. But it's important to note that that was certainly a big change and a big sort of revolutionary shift. You can also see the impact on what's eventually going to be some very influential revolutions and shakeups in sort of the world's politics. For example, the American Revolution is going to be very much based upon the ideas of the Enlightenment, the ideas of John Locke, right? The words of John Locke are very much sort of taken and used in the Declaration of Independence. Ideas of sort of Adam Smith and economics are going to be used partially to justify sort of the economic arguments for the revolution. These are all going to be examples of very much sort of how these ideas are going to become revolutionary during their own time. And they're very much going to be still impactful with us today. I would say, most of the ideas of sort of modern day human rights are going to be dated back to this time period. The sort of importance of individuality and sort of individual reasoning, it's a general sort of reliance upon science, knowledge, and reason. Once more, not everyone perhaps is very good at that, and there's certainly a lot of debate about what qualifies and what does not. But the idea that that's sort of what you should be doing very much is tied back to this time period. But I think very much, if you're going to be talking about sort of a lot of the modern sensibilities we have surrounding rights and government and so forth, certainly are going to be coming from the Enlightenment. And as I mentioned, while they didn't necessarily have all the answers at the time, and there were a lot of limitations to who they wanted to apply these to, as time went on, it's going to be applied to a broader and broader group of people. And people are saying, well, we want to make this ideal a reality. And working towards that, I think, is where, in a lot of ways, you see sort of the modern day movements for rights and justice that we see up until today. Compare and contrast the American, French, and Haitian revolutions. What similarities do you see with how these revolutions played out? What were their differences? Well, to begin with, these three of these revolutions were based on ideas of the Enlightenment. You can tell it sort of very strongly in their declarations of independence, in the governing documents that they are eventually going to write, the constitutions, that they're very much going to be, after this revolutionary time period, trying to use the language of the Enlightenment to sort of justify these revolutions and to conceptualize sort of the new countries and the new nations that they are going to be creating. So ideas of universal rights to life, liberty, and happiness very much present in each of them. A certain amount of equality, at least among sort of people of the same status, depending on which revolution you are talking about. So these are all going to be sort of similarities that you are seeing. And essentially all three are going to be based upon the idea of the importance of self-determination by by people. In the case of course, the British colonies wanting self-determination from Great Britain to become the United States of America. In France, it was essentially the people wanting self-determination away from the monarchy, saying the people should be making the decisions for France, not the monarchs. And in the case of Haiti, it was, of course, enslaved individuals saying we want the self-determination essentially over our own lives, and trying to take that power away from both the people who had been sort of their controllers or overseers or owners, or those who were trying to prop them up and keep them in power. So very much the sort of self-determination of the majority of the people are what is going to be the sort of driving factor in these three. So how do they differ? The American Revolution, you can really very much look at it as more of a top-down revolution. It was actually a fairly conservative revolution in general. If you notice the sort of disconnect that began between the British and the American colonies, it was very economic based, right? That the idea that the British wanted to tax the colonies was very, very offensive to the colonists. And partially this is because the colonists, particularly the ones who were sort of leading the revolution, oftentimes were of the sort of upper echelons of society. It wasn't slaves leading this revolution. It wasn't, poor laborers leading this revolution. No, the leaders of the American Revolution were lawyers. They were doctors. They were plantation owners. They were merchants. These were the people who led the American Revolution, and primarily, they were increasingly finding the economic policies of Great Britain to be, like I said, very problematic. At the same point in time, though, there was a real feeling of disrespect. These were the people who felt that they were at the top of their society and that they deserved sort of the same level and caliber of respect as like the British nobility did. The British nobility did not have to pay taxes, so when eventually they started being forced to pay taxes by the British government, they were saying this is the government trying to treat us like we are servants, like we are slaves, which of course a lot of people pointed out was very hypocritical because the same people who were saying this oftentimes were the same people who, owned actual slaves. So they certainly knew what inequality was all about, and they were perfectly fine with it as long as they weren't the ones who were on the wrong end of it. And as soon as they felt like someone was starting to impinge on what they perceived of as their rights, they were more than willing to then fight against that power, and that power ended up being the British. Of course, the revolution is eventually successful. The colonists who are fighting back, the revolutionaries, are very big underdogs in the fight, but through some very good generalship by George Washington, through the French joining in and trying to sort of stick it to the British, after their setbacks in the 7 Years' War, this all culminates with eventually the revolutionaries being victorious and being able to sort of set up their own nation. It's important to note, though, that the American Revolution was really, there was no shakeup of the social order. The people who were essentially on the top in the colonies at the beginning of the Revolution are the exact same people who are on the top at the end of the Revolution, and they start forming a new country that's going to be very beneficial to them. And there's a lot of people in the United States who were not overly, or whose interests were not very well served by this. The British government was the main force keeping more colonization back from American Indian lands. So after the United States wins the Revolution, there's really an all-out assault on the lands controlled by American Indians as the United States starts expanding further and further into the continent. Enslaved individuals. There's lots of evidence that slavery was much closer to being abolished, and actually was abolished much sooner in Great Britain than it was in what was going to be the United States. So very much, if you're talking about an enslaved individual, they really did not see much benefit at all in the American Revolution, and really weren't going to see any benefits, and for many years down the line, until eventually there's a reckoning with the institution of slavery around the time period of the Civil War. So there's certainly a clear sort of contrast of those who sort of benefited from the revolution and those who didn't. The French Revolution, on the other hand, was much more of a social revolution. It was a revolution against that sort of upper elite class, the monarchy, the nobility, the clergy, with the entire idea of trying to destroy that idea of the three estates, right? The two estates, one estate sort of being the monarchy and the nobility, the other state being sort of the religion and the church, and that they controlled the vast majority of power and wealth and land within France. And then the third estate was made up of everyone else, it's the vast majority of the people. And the French Revolution was really about that third estate rising up and sort of wanting their own self-determination, their own rights. Once more, the Enlightenment was very, very prevalent within France. Voltaire, for example, Diderot. These are all examples of sort of leaders of the Enlightenment who had been French. Um, and so you definitely see it a different form of a revolution than you saw in the American Revolution, which was much more of a political revolution and not a social revolution. Um, Also, the French Revolution allows sort of the world to see the strength that this kind of self-determination can bring to a location, particularly the national strength that France shows when it starts fighting back against the other countries in Europe that are trying to essentially invade France and put an end to the revolution. The French Revolution, the attack on the monarchy and the nobility, of course, made all the other monarchs and nobles around Europe very, very nervous. They did not want their own populations to behave in a similar fashion, and essentially they launch a series of war against France. France, however, is able to form a very strong national army, much stronger, I would say, than their monarchical army had been previous to this, and they're able to not just defend themselves, but actually expand and push their borders, and really sort of show the strength that can be seen when there's sort of this large-scale buy-in to sort of one common ideal. Of course, the French Revolution is also going to be different because essentially throughout time it gets corrupted. People within France see the strength that France is exhibiting and is going to try to use that for their own purposes and their own agendas. This is going to lead to things like the Reign of Terror, where one political group essentially sort of uses the revolution to gain control and gain power, and then starts trying to execute all of their political rivals, and certainly makes it a much less holistic revolution and starts trying to make it much more so that one group can take power within the country. Of course, in the long run, eventually it's going to lead to just another version of a dictatorship, as eventually Napoleon is going to take over. He's still going to be able to use this national strength, which was created through the time period of the revolution, and go on to become very close to actually conquering all of Europe. But essentially, the revolution at that point in time is all but dead. I mean, Napoleon still plays lip service to it, but from that time period going on, you have at best a constitutional monarchy, and at worst just another imperial system. So also the French Revolution, I would say, is much sort of shorter lasting than the American Revolution, but the lesson of sort of what that idea of a unified nation can do becomes incredibly relevant throughout Europe, which we'll be seeing in just a moment here. And finally, the Haitian Revolution was certainly a political and a social revolution, and is pretty much the most successful slave uprising in history, as essentially the slave population of Haiti was able to rise up to arm themselves to overthrow the people who had been controlling them, and essentially fight back against a number of European armies who were trying to take control of the island. Toussaint, the sort of leader of the revolution, was incredibly good strategist. He was able to sort of play the competing European powers, who were still essentially fighting the Napoleonic Wars at this point in time, use those powers against each other, and able to eventually get strong enough to just remove all of them from the island. And in that sense, I think you can sort of consider the Haitian Revolution the most successful for the majority of the population of all these revolutions, as the vast majority of the population who had been enslaved prior to this were going to be free and able to participate to a certain degree within the new country they were forming. Of course, Haiti is not going to be without its challenges moving forward from this time period, and part of that is because for a long while they were essentially just sort of isolated on the national stage. Countries that still owned slaves, such as the United States, didn't want anything to do with Haiti and certainly weren't going to be cooperating or helping them in any way, shape, or form. And neither were those European countries who had been fighting to take and gain control of the island. So Haiti was going to essentially have to sort of figure it out on themselves on an island that certainly has much fewer sort of natural resources than, say, France or the continental United States. So throughout time, certainly it's going to run into struggles, but the immediate aftermath, I would say, would be primarily a much better situation for the people who were living in Haiti after the revolution than prior to it. So very interesting to see the differences and similarities between these three very important revolutions that happened around this time period, and certainly are going to have some very monumental, long-lasting impacts and effects. What do you see as some of the positive aspects to the ideology of nationalism that developed in the 1800s and still shapes our world today? And what do you see as some of nationalism's drawbacks and problems? Now, really, if you look at the world that we live in today, the development of nationalism is probably the most important aspect that determines how our world is politically organized that we live in. If you want to think of the Industrial Revolution as sort of being the main sort of development that led to how our economies are sort of organized, nationalism is very much the main way that our political systems are organized to this day. So very, very much of sort of importance when you're thinking about how and why it was developed here in the 1800s. I mean, to a lot of people today, it just sort of seems natural that this is the way the world is created. There's these individual people having self-determination in their own nations, but that was really not the case. Of course, if you remember talking earlier in the semester, primarily the world was divided up into larger multi-cultural and multi-ethnic empires, controlling large areas, maybe smaller, more independent kingdoms, but nothing like the sort of nationalistic shape that eventually was going to be built during this time period. So what are some of the reasons why it developed, and what are some of the positive aspects that people identified? Well, certainly you see a much closer relationship between government and people under nationalism. That there is this idea that certainly is an Enlightenment idea that sort of people matter within politics or within the construction of the government to some degree or another, and that people should be sort of determining the laws and the policies that direct their life. In a broader sense, sort of national unity and national identity are very much linked to this, and it can be a positive aspect. That really before this, most people's primary allegiance probably would have been to their hometown, maybe to a region, possibly to a religion. Those would have been the ways that people identified themselves. Increasingly, through nationalism, people are going to start identifying themselves as an American, as a German, as an Italian. These were going to be sort of a different conceptualization in the ways that people thought of themselves. Also, the development of nationalism is going to lead to larger and more sophisticated states. Because there's more buy-in from sort of the general population, and oftentimes that will lead to sort of more obligations on the part of the government towards that population. It meant that the size and scale of governments were going to have to increase, and that the sophistication of states was going to have to be increased as well. So you see very much an increase in the ability to, for example, have infrastructure within these countries. The entire sort of infrastructure around education is very much tied to nationalism. That people wanted the ability to have sort of all people within their country receive an education and to have a basic sort of common set of knowledge for all of the people, or some people at least within their countries. Now, certainly that's not the only story behind why education was developed, and increasingly that sort of gets into the drawbacks and problems of nationalism, because one way to view nationalism is essentially a counteraction to the Enlightenment, which might seem sort of counterintuitive because certain parts of nationalism seem like it should be things like that nationalism wanted, increased participation in government and self-determination and so forth. Essentially, what the European power structures do, the monarchs, the nobles, the aristocrats, what they're able to do is find ways to use nationalism to essentially curtail the more sort of radical elements of the Enlightenment. So finding ways to incorporate those more sort of basic elements of self-determination and participation for some people, while not terribly upsetting the social order within a country. So therefore, they're going to essentially be using propaganda, be using the idea of competition with other nations, be using the competition within a country between what they consider sort of the majority group of the nation and minority groups within the nation. They're going to be using all of these elements in order to find ways so that the majority of the wealth and power are still going to be within the hands of the same people who it was before, these reforms would have taken place. So a big part of this question is often sort of what is a nation? And in theory, a nation is supposed to be in its sort of most pure form, one people self-determining based upon a similar or the same language, religion, history, values, and culture. The problem is no nation is going to have that level of holisticness within it. No nation is going to only have one set of people with one language and religion and views and values and culture. Every single nation is multicultural because there are lots and lots of various people of various ideas, oftentimes various religion, various ethnic groups, all living inside the borders that one nation has sort of declared or carved out for itself. And this means that oftentimes there's going to be a lot of exclusion and hostility to anyone who doesn't nicely fit within that notion of who should be part of this nation, who should be that one people, what's the one language they should be talking, what's the one history they should be following, what are those certain values that they should be following. Anyone who sort of is outside those bounds is oftentimes going to be looked at with suspicion. They're going to be treated hostility, and oftentimes, if there's going to be trouble or problems, it is going to be that sort of upper class that is going to be using minority groups as scapegoats. That no, we're not actually the cause of your problems. The cause of your problems are actually these other people who really aren't part of us anyways, and we should go ahead and focus on hating them and persecuting them and blaming them, rather than oftentimes looking at what the real causes of problems within the society actually were. So, for example, once nationalism becomes increased, you actually see an increase in, for example, persecution of Jewish populations and groups within these countries, where they had for a long time sort of been minorities within Christian Europe, and they had been persecuted for a long period of time. But in a lot of cases, it's only going to get worse. And of course, we can think of the sort of most extreme outcome of this being the Holocaust, and how they essentially, the German state under Adolf Hitler, decided they were going to try to eliminate and kill all the Jewish people living within their borders and the borders of the countries that they had taken over. That's very much linked to that idea of nationalism, and essentially after the First World War, and we'll get into more of this later, the Nazis trying to blame all the problems of Germany on this sort of ethnic minority, rather than essentially Germany just causing its own problems by getting into the First World War. Also, it's going to lead to the problem of a lot of hyper-competition between these nations. If the nobles and the monarchs and the aristocrats are going to be spending so much time convincing the population that they're the best people on earth, and that they're the pure people and the people with the best language and the best history and the best culture, they're going to start looking very negatively on anyone from any other country or from any other culture. And ultimately, a lot of the competition that you see developing in Europe through the 1800s into the early 1900s, really, I'd say culminating in the First World War, is based on this sort of hyper-competition that these European countries were going to ferment with this ideology of nationalism. Also, with so much more buy-in from a larger percentage of the population, you're going to see larger armies, larger military conflicts, and eventually this move towards the idea of total war, which is essentially a war isn't just between the leaders of one country and the leaders of another country. It's going to be between the populations and everyone in one country versus everyone in another country, which was really never the way war was thought of before this. It was essentially, a king or a monarch would have their army. Another king or monarch would have their private army, essentially. They'd fight it out. But they're really, the average people in the countries wouldn't have much feeling one way or another to people living in one of these other countries. There just wasn't been unless they were in the army much contact even between them. So that's sort of bringing more and more people into this sort of competition and these military conflicts. And this is also going to be exacerbated, and you can't separate it from the Industrial Revolution, because the Industrial Revolution is going to make these larger armies possible. It's going to make it possible to feed larger and larger armies. It's going to make it possible to clothe larger and larger armies. It's going to make it possible to arm larger and larger armies. So the Industrial Revolution and nationalism very much are tied in hand with one another. But it's interesting to see how, there's a lot of pros and a lot of cons. And although nationalism has, for the most part, sort of won out in a global sense, I think it's fair to take a look at it and say what parts of it maybe work and what parts of it don't, and maybe is there a better way to sort of politically construct the world than to be into these, nationalistic states. Because as we've seen, there's quite a few problems that can come along with that. View the map on 28.4 on pages 662 and 663, then answer the following questions. What can viewing these maps tell us about the Italian and German unifications? Can these maps help reveal why these unifications resulted from diplomacy and war rather than popular nationalist action? First of all, what a lot of people pointed out is that you can certainly see that these unifications happened in stages. It wasn't just kind of like one revolution or one uprising or one event that toppled an old order and brought in a new order. It was much more pieced together in stages over time as sort of pragmatic politicians and states sort of saw opportunities to expand their control and were able to take advantage of that. So that's the other thing that it really sort of reveals is just sort of how quickly the unifications occurred. Both of them taking place in, to a large degree, 10 to 20 year time span. So still, I mean, in the broad theme of things, pretty quickly, seeing as how both of those locations had essentially not been united since the Roman Empire. So for well over 1,000 years, there had not been any kind of unified state in Germany or Italy. It had been partitioned off into much smaller regions and oftentimes were controlled by peoples outside of either Germany or Italy. So the fact that they were able to reunite those countries in such a relatively short amount of time, especially given how much external influence and pressure there was from surrounding peoples and surrounding states who had interests and history in the region, is pretty remarkable. The maps can also really show you that both the unifications developed in sort of specific centers. Prussia, in the case of German unification, the Kingdom of Piedmont, Sardinia in Italy, and that essentially the phases of unification were adding to those sort of already established power bases. So Prussia and Piedmont and Sardinia had already been sort of strong independent states before this time period, and they essentially were able to use these broader regional nationalist sentiments in order to increase their own power. When Germany is created, it's essentially the Prussian government and state that is going to be ruling over it, and when Italy is created, it's essentially going to be the Piedmont Sardinia government and monarch that is going to be ruling over Italy. So while it's essentially unification of a broader geographic area, the government and the ruling system was already established in place in one location and then branched out from there. You can also see on this map how unification was very much a result of wars and military conflicts. How most of the time it wasn't, one group peacefully withdrawing and handing it over to another people. That certainly happened at some points in time, but oftentimes it was going to be take some kind of military engagement, whether it was the Seven Years' War or the Crimean War, or the Franco-Prussian War, in order to really get these the boundaries moved and to solidify control of one of these kingdoms to a larger area in what's eventually going to be the development of those nations. So, can the maps reveal why these unifications resulted from diplomacy rather than and war rather than popular nationalist action? And to a certain degree, just the broad level of multiple states involved, what a long, drawn-out period of time that it was, and the level of diplomacy that was also involved, really meant that there had to be a incredible amount of sort of strategy and organization to make these unifications possible. And those are something that just sort of mass public sentiment didn't have any kind of apparatus to make happen. There could have been people who wanted to unify, but they didn't have the ability or the power to do so. It really took sort of these already strong states with the desire to expand their power, and then sort of combining that desire with those nationalist sentiments in order to sort of make the creation of these unified states a reality. Looking at our modern comparisons here, comparing one of the figures in our readings to someone that people know in their personal life. And I thought there was a lot of really interesting comparisons here and a lot of fun ways that people took this question. Historically, we had people discussing John Locke, Voltaire, the Enlightenment philosophers, Olympe de Gouges, a sort of French playwright and early feminist, Thomas Jefferson, Louis XIV, Napoleon, Bismarck. A lot of very strong personalities were covered, and it was interesting to see people comparing these historical figures to their friends, their relatives, their teacher. Someone compared one of them to themselves, and really sort of seeing, what if these people had a chance to meet and talk? What would they get along? Would they not? What kind of conversation might they have? Overall, I thought the class did a really fun job doing the sort of what ifs around this, and really, sort of making those personal connections. How, I think this person in history probably might not have been all that dissimilar to someone I know or can think of in my life today. So, overall, very good job. All right, moving on to our discussion questions here for the week. So how does Fichte and Sullivan define their nation? In their view, what constitutes their national identities? Both these documents give a very good perception of how nationalism is being developed in Germany in a European sense and in the United States. And you can tell with Fichte that really the idea of Germanness is based on this sort of mythological past that he is creating here. He spends a lot of times depicting how the Germans opposed the Romans and refused to assimilate to Roman culture, how they were able to preserve their own culture. And that seems to be where he is really sort of drawing a lot of his idea on how to sort of define the German people who are related to those Germans who refused to be assimilated by the Romans. He says this in a number of different places. For example, he says, "In this belief in our earliest common forefathers, the original stock of the new culture, the Germans, as the Romans called them, bravely resisted the oncoming world domination of the Romans." So you can see right there he's saying that the Germans resisted the oncoming domination of the Romans, and that they were the earliest forefathers of the sort of German nation. He goes on, "Freedom to them meant just this, remaining Germans and continuing to settle their own affairs independently and in accordance with the original spirit of their race, going on with their development in accordance with the same spirit and propagating this independence in their prosperity. Posterity, not prosperity, posterity. So, really what he's saying here is, first of all, he's making that tie-in to race, right? He talks about sort of the German blood in a number of places. He talks about the German race in a number of places. So once more, this is getting convoluted with sort of this idea that individual nations are also somehow comprised of individual races, which we'll be talking more about this in the coming weeks, but nationalism is very much going to get conflated with racism, and this idea that various nations and people in various nations are all going to be of different races, and it's going to biologically be completely 100% inaccurate. But this is the way that people are starting to perceive themselves, that the Germans living in Germany today are somehow sort of racially pure, going back to this sort of original German people who opposed the Romans, and that primarily this sort of effort and ability to preserve their culture is sort of, one of the things that defines Germans as Germans. And finally, he states, it is they whom we must thank for everything that we have been as a nation since those days, and to them we shall be indebted for everything that we shall be in the future, unless things come to an end with us now, and the last drop of blood inherited from them has dried up in our veins. So very much praising sort of this idea of those mythological ancestors that they are based upon, and that there's still this somehow sort of link within their blood that that sort of makes them unique and special. Going on to O'Sullivan's document, as opposed to Fichte, who is very much trying to develop this mythological past, O'Sullivan is trying to completely cut the United States off from history. He says this right from the beginning: the American people have determined their origin from many other nations, and the Declaration of National Independence being entirely based on the great principle of human equality. These facts demonstrate that once our disconnected position as regards to any other nation, that we have, in reality, but little connection with the past history of any of them, and still less with all antiquity, its glories, or its crimes. He goes on to say, our national birth was the beginning of a new history, the formation and progress of a united political system which separates us from the past and connects us with the future only. So in O'Sullivan's view, he's defining his nation as essentially only beginning with the Declaration of Independence, and that the creation of this new governing system essentially makes the United States sort of its completely new thing with no ties to any sort of history that came before it. And that's how he is sort of choosing to define it. So defining it very different ways between O'Sullivan and Fichte, but they are very much identifying what they sort of feel those national identities are. Going on to question number 2, according to the authors, what aspects make Germany and America exceptional? Well, Fichte definitely feels that the devotion to their culture, both people in the past and modern day, the sort of racial elements of that, and that sort of that link and tie-in to sort of that proud history are all things that sort of make Germans exceptional. He says, for example, they assumed as a matter of course that every man would rather die than become half a Roman, and that a true German could only want to live in order to be and remain just a German, and bring up his children as Germans. So once more, that sort of very proud tie-in to the people in the past who sort of maintained that German identity. It is their unyielding resistance to which the whole modern world has to thank for being what it is now. And he very much sort of says that the world would be a terrible place today if it wasn't for those great Germans persevering and making sure that there was a strong German nation today, is essentially sort of what he goes on and is applying here. So that's certainly ways that he sort of feels that Germany is exceptional. For O'Sullivan, it's very much tied in with the system of government. He very much is harping on these ideas of equality and liberty, and really bringing those to the forefront. For example, he says, so it is destined, because the principle upon which a nation is organized fixes its destiny and that of equality is perfect, is universal. So the idea of universal equality is very, very much brought to the forefront. Also, the fact that he tries to separate the actions of the United States from pretty much any other empire or monarchy or any other governing system really in history. And that, in his perspective, the United States had sort of been much more peaceful. He says, our annals describe no scenes of horrid carnage, nor have the American people ever suffered themselves to be led on by wicked ambition to depopulate the land, to spread desolation far and wide, that a human being might be placed on a seat of supremacy. And of course, we'll be talking about this more in question number 4, about one of the problems being the accuracy around this, but that's certainly the argument that he is making, that not only does the United States have this fantastic form of government based upon representation and equality, but it hasn't done any bad things, that it's completely free of all the horrid things that nations in the past have done. Finally, he wraps up, what friend of humanity, liberty, civilization, and refinement can cast his view over the past history of the monarchies and aristocracies of antiquity and not deplore that they ever existed? So once more making that clear distinction between what he's seeing as sort of the democracy in the United States and its representative government, and what he is viewing as sort of the sins of the past which are perpetrated by these other governments. Moving on to question number 3, what are the rights and responsibilities that the authors see people having to their nation? For Fichte, it's very much sacrifice, right? He comes off right from the beginning sort of talking about how really a person's individual existence shouldn't mean anything as long as the nation endures and the nation persists. And this very much ties in, right, of his sort of narrative that he's trying to construct about how the Germans have done this throughout the years. So if it's necessary to sort of sacrifice yourself to protect the nation, he thinks that's something that absolutely all Germans should be willing to do. He pretty much outright says it. In order to save his nation, he must be ready to even die, that it may live, and that he may live in it only the only life for which he has ever wished. For O'Sullivan, he's really seeing this as sort of a call for America to spread its glory, right? He wants to say, we have created this perfect government system. We have done no wrong, so why don't we take this as a roadshow to the rest of the world? Let's get everyone on board. He says America is destined for better deeds. Another location, he says, the far-reaching and boundless future will be an era of American greatness. We are the nation of human progress, and who will and what can set limits to our own onward march. And finally, sort of the most pressing example of this, America has been chosen, and her high example shall smite unto death the tyranny of kings, hierarchs, and oligarchs, and carry the glad tidings of peace and goodwill, where the myriads now endure an existence scarcely more enviable than that of beasts of the field. So very much saying that America is sort of destined to spread its glories, to smash down these old governments and these old republics. So that's sort of the sort of responsibility that he sees the United States sort of taking on here. So those are the arguments that both these authors set up, and really question number 4 here is what's going to tie all this together, and that's the potential issues and problems that these ideologies might cause. Because that's really where you start seeing the truth of nationalism. These are both sort of prime examples of nationalistic documents talking about how super great their own nation and their own people are. But in both cases, a huge problem is that they have a very inaccurate interpretation of the past. They're really not based on anything in reality. For example, Fichte's relationship, the way he depicts the relationship between the Romans and the Germans is not really accurate. There was a lot more interplay and go-between and acculturation going on between the Germans and the Romans over hundreds of years. For part of that time, Germans were essentially providing Rome with its armies, and large portions of Germans lived within the Roman Empire. Also, this idea that there's this sort of unbroken culture or people from the Germanic tribes that the Romans were encountering to the Germans who were now living in Germany is completely false. There had been all sorts of population movements throughout the years. The the land had changed hands multiple times. The religions were completely different from, sort of the Germanic peoples would have been essentially pagans. Now, essentially, most of the people were either Catholic or Protestants living in Germany. So there's really no argument to make that these are the exact same people who are living in the region. Perhaps in some areas, but as a whole, it's a lot more dicey. And trying to, sort of construct this idea of an unbroken bound of German culture does not hold up, because the culture of Germany in the time period early 1800s, or early 1800s, when Fichte is writing this, and the Germanic tribes that the Romans were encountering are completely different people. So that doesn't quite hold up to scrutiny. And one big issue with this is that essentially, if you're going on to try to form a national identity around essentially just making stuff up, it sounds like a nice story. It sounds like something that someone who wants to be proud to be a German would like to hear. But if it's not based on reality, I mean, you're sort of encouraging people to sacrifice themselves and to fight and to die for a myth. And I think that can certainly be problematic. O'Sullivan's document is no less historically inaccurate. Certainly, the United States wasn't created in a vacuum. That the British colonies and the people who formed the British colonies had a long history in the Americas, going back hundreds of years, and even before that in Europe. And also the entire idea of, what caused the American Revolution, what influences they had. A lot of it was based on the Enlightenment, which came from Europe. The governing system that was created was a combination of sort of both Enlightenment ideas and sort of taking the ideas of republicanism from the Romans. So that has very deep ties. So the idea that this was something completely new that was created here is really not accurate, as O'Sullivan is trying to make it. And certainly, any time I'd say anyone tries to sort of cut cut a nation or people or any issue out of history, that's a red flag, because it means that you don't want to look at a holistic story of what's actually going on. And once more, this leads to very bad history, because if you take all those elements out of what actually caused the revolution and how and why the country was formed, you don't have much of an idea at all of what any of it really means. The biggest problem, though, of O'Sullivan, as many people pointed out, is that this might be the most hypocritical document in history. The idea that the United States was great because it's completely founded on ideas of equality and unity is completely asinine at a time period when slavery was still very much in existence, still very much legal, was a huge part of the United States economy, and in every way, shape, and form was the complete opposite of everything O'Sullivan was trying to preach here. It's like he's just pretending it doesn't exist, or not wanting to address that fact. And really, that simple fact negates pretty much everything O'Sullivan says. Also, it's interesting how he has that line of, we don't depopulate the land, and as he's comparing it to other groups, where there was essentially a whole onslaught, war at this point in time against American Indian groups in an effort to, not surprisingly, take their land for themselves. So this really is not based on history at all, and the very rosy picture that O'Sullivan is painting is essentially just ignoring what's really happening. It's painting a very inaccurate version of reality, and it's once more very problematic, where if all you do is sit there and talk about how great you are and how everything you say and do is right and how you're sort of divinely appointed to be super extra great for everyone, you can justify doing anything, really, and it's going to be in your mind perceived as being right or correct. And when you get a country or a nation behaving that way, it can be incredibly problematic, because you don't see oftentimes the atrocities that you're committing right before your own eyes. So yeah, I think in a lot of ways nationalism is problematic for that very reason. And I think it's why it's important to take a look at these documents and really call out how and why they are deeply inaccurate on many, many levels. All right, that's all I have for this week. Thank you all very much.